It is so important and so not spoken about on YouTube at all from an Islamic perspective. What happened to the word trauma? Because something shifted in the last 15 years, how people understand their own suffering and for how an industry grew up around that suffering. I put myself in a difficult situation with this topic. It is so important and so not spoken about on YouTube at all from an Islamic perspective, because I think it's so delicate and it's so easy to say something wrong and make real damage. So, Bismillah, let me say something clearly before anything else. Real trauma exists. A person who lived through something that shattered their world, whatever the form, but this shattering made them experience something that the human system, physical and spiritual, was not designed to absorb casually. This is a real condition. It has been documented for centuries. Al-Balkhī described it, Ibn Sīnā treated it. The Islamic medical and psychological tradition has clinical tools for it. And we will cover those tools in a future video, inshallah. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about what happened to the word trauma. Because something shifted in the last 15 years. Incidentally, that's the years I've been into psychology. So I've seen this happening live. And the consequences have been enormous for how people understand their own suffering and for how an industry grew up around that suffering and for how a narrative about permanent damage developed that may be doing more harm than the original pain. Trauma used to mean something specific, a discrete, overwhelming event that produced a recognizable syndrome. Flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares, dissociation, a soldier returning from combat, a survivor of assault, a victim of a natural disaster, or some forms of grief. Specific events producing specific symptoms. Then the definition expanded. Trauma stopped meaning the thing that almost destroyed you and started meaning anything that overwhelmed you. Not being seen for who you are, trauma. An unkind word from a teacher. Parents' divorce, a stressful job, a breakup. The bar dropped so low that ordinary human difficulty became pathology. And an entire industry grew around this expanded definition. Books, therapies, courses, retreats, certification, podcasts, and an entire identity category of trauma survivor. The trauma industry reframes human difficulty as permanent neurological damage. So it needs you to stay broken. The point is that it sells the diagnosis and the treatment in the same package. And today we're going to walk through 5 criticisms of the trauma narrative. I chose to take the ones that come from within the Western intellectual tradition, framed with their own words and concepts. And for each one, I'll show you what Islamic psychology sees instead as a completely different paradigm, able not only to criticize, but to offer a solution. This topic is so important to me. I was trained in Western psychology, then I was a bit skeptic of that. Then I trained into neuroscience up to my PhD. And then I shifted to Islamic psychology. And trauma is really a bridge among all of 3 my areas of expertise, with one of my other strong interests, which is not really expertise, which is philosophy. So let's start with criticism 1. The Unfalsifiable narrative. The book that launched the modern trauma narrative is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It's sold millions of copies. It's recommended by therapists and even colleges use it to teach psychology. Its central claim is that trauma rewires the brain. It wrecks the insula, it imprints the amygdala, it produces a constant flood of stress hormones. The idea is that your body permanently stores the score of what happened to you. Those claims are presented as settled science, but they're not. Dr. Michael Scheringa, a clinical psychologist who has spent decades researching PTSD, systematically reviewed the studies by van der Kolk. And what he found should give everyone something to think. The vast majority of the fMRI studies cited in the book are cross-sectional, meaning they are snapshots of different people. They scan people who already have symptoms and compare them to people who don't. But without scanning the same people before the event, you cannot determine whether the brain differences were caused by the experience or whether there were pre-existing vulnerabilities that made the person more likely to develop symptoms afterward. Start from the insula, supposedly wrecked by trauma. 20 out of 21 studies were cross-sectional, with contradictory results. Some showed the insula overactive, some showed it underactive. The only longitudinal study, the one that scanned people before and after, found no change. The amygdala, supposedly bearing the imprint of trauma. 13 out of 21 studies found no significant difference between PTSD patients and controls. That's the majority showing nothing. The cortisol claim, so famous this one. Supposedly there is a constant flood of stress hormones. Meta-analysis show that cortisol levels in PTSD patients are frequently normal. And in many cases, they're actually lower than controls. This is the opposite of what the narrative claims. Van der Kolk even cites Jaak Panksepp's research to claim that lack of maternal bonding causes a failure to develop kindness receptors. The actual study showed that social isolation in mice, which I'd like to remind everybody are not humans indeed, increases opiate receptor counts, directly contradicting the claim in the book. This is not fringe skepticism coming from Muslims. This is what the peer-reviewed data shows when you read the studies rather than the bestseller and the person who made the whole career out of it. And here the structural problem that ties it all together. The narrative creates a diagnostic loop that is unfalsifiable. If you remember a difficult event, that's the trauma. If you don't remember anything, you had trauma, just the body's remembering for you. Every symptom, anxiety, procrastination, difficulty in relationship, muscle tension becomes retroactive proof of a wound you may not even know you had. There is no possible evidence against the claim. And a claim that can't be disproven is not science, it's just a narrative. The Islamic psychological tradition operates on a fundamentally different principle, which is differential diagnosis. We never use one label that explains everything, but we work with precision about what is actually wrong and where in the human being it's happening. Al-Balkhī distinguished sadness with a cause from sadness without a cause, saying that different conditions require different treatment. The tradition distinguishes conditions of the Nafs from conditions of the qalb from conditions of the ruh. A person whose Nafs is undisciplined is in a different situation from a person whose qalb is veiled, who is in a different situation from a person whose ruh is starving. Each requires different intervention. In the theoretical mapping of suluk, which is this process, the skilled practitioner draws on multiple diagnostic lenses. Al-Ghazālī's model identifies the appetitive desires, shahwat, as the engine of many heart diseases. Al-Qayyim divides all conditions into divides of doubt, shubha, and desires of desire, shahwa, each requiring a completely different treatment. Ibn Taymiyya locates two root diseases, kibr and hasad, from which all others grow. The same person presenting with the same symptoms might receive a different diagnosis depending on which lens reveals the root. A person with chronic rage might be diagnosed through Al-Ghazālī's lens as unregulated appetite, through Ibn al-Qayyim's lens as shahwa, hijacking the heart's will, through Ibn Taymiyya's lens as ṣabr, defending his self-image. Each lens produces a complementary treatment. That's clinical precision. That's what a 12th century tradition of observation and treatment produces. The trauma industry, dressed in science, offers one label for everything. Our tradition offers a diagnostic framework with the sophistication to match the complexity of the human being. And then we also have the chicken or the egg problem. And here's a question that the trauma narrative never asks. What if some people are more vulnerable to being overwhelmed? Not because of a past wound, but because of their current state. That can be physiological, poor sleep, chronic inflammation, metabolic dysfunction, sedentary lifestyle, poor nutrition, or constant arguments with their spouse, or living in a small concrete box and working in another small concrete box. All of these are factors that reduce the nervous system's capacity to handle difficulty. A person whose body is robust and well-maintained might experience a stressor and recover. A person whose body is depleted might experience the same stressor and be overwhelmed. In this model, the overwhelming experience is not the root cause. It's the tipping point for a system that was already struggling. The trauma is the straw that broke an already weakened back. And this isn't just my theory. The largest meta-analysis of effective treatment for depression and PTSD consistently rank exercise and behavioral interventions, which are approaches that change what you do in the present, not what you remember from the past, are the most effective. Above talk therapy, above trauma uncovering modalities. The evidence points to action. In our tradition, Al-Balkhī's concept of ishtibāk, the entanglement of body and soul, describes exactly what the metabolic critics are discovering. When the body is depleted, the Nafs loses capacity. The two are woven together. You cannot treat one and ignore the other. This, for Al-Balkhī, was the starting point of his entire clinical system, which gives the title of his book, Sustenance for Body and Soul. And the treatment the tradition prescribes is behavioral first. Not because talking is useless, but because the Nafs follows what the body does. Al-Balkhī prescribed graduated interventions, small actions that move the body and the Nafs out of a frozen state. Walk, eat properly, sleep, change your environment. Begin with what you can manage and build from there. The Prophet ﷺ prescribed physical action for emotional states, with a precision that modern behavioral therapy is only now starting to catch up. Wudu for anger, cold water, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. Changing your physical position, interrupting the body's fight mobilization. Walking to the masjid even. This is movement combined with environmental change, combined with social contact or fasting. Deliberate restraint of the bodies to strengthen the Nafs, self-governance. The wise Arabic saying, move away from the place in which heedlessness afflicted you, is the first-line behavioral intervention. Not talk about the place, not process your feelings about the place, not where you feel the place in the body. Move away from it. Change the body's relationship to the environment. And the Nafs follows. The tradition trusts the body-soul bridge in both direction. When the Nafs is sick, the body suffers. And when you move the body, strengthen it, discipline it, care for it, the Nafs recovers capacity. Your body has a right over you. That's a hadith. Treating it as an afterthought while endlessly excavating the past is a clinical error that our tradition would never make. It's also a paradox, because in the Western mind, the only thing that exists is the body. Everything is matter. So instead of treating the body, meaning making you stronger, making you healthier, cutting junk food, doing strength training, what is proposed is let's talk about it, let's release it. That this is really a bypassing of the clear physical cause. It's as if they're making up for a spiritual or hidden dimension that they themselves deny ontologically. But let's get to the third criticism. The nocebo effect. There's a phenomenon in medicine called the nocebo effect. That's the mirror image of placebo. A negative expectation produces negative symptoms. If a doctor tells you a medication has terrible side effects, you're more likely to experience them, even if you receive the sugar pill. Expectation at all levels shapes physiology. What you believe about your condition changes how your condition manifests. Now, consider what happens when you tell millions of people your body permanently stores your trauma. The damage is inscribed in your cells. Your brain has been rewired by what happened to you. The score is being kept and it can never be erased. What does that do to a person's expectation of their own capacity to heal? It installs a ceiling. It says the best you can hope for is managing a condition that will never fully resolve. You are permanently marked. Your body will remind you whether you want it to or not. You can learn coping strategies, but the damage is done. And this is the nocebo at a civilizational scale. An entire generation has been told that their suffering is permanent, biological, and unescapable. And the expectation of permanence becomes self-fulfilling. Because a person who believes they cannot fully heal will not fully heal. Not because the damage was irreparable, because the belief that it was irreparable prevented the repair. The Islamic tradition makes a claim about the human being that directly contradicts the permanent damage narrative. The claim is this: somewhere inside you, your fitra is intact. We have a hadith about it. Every child is born in a state of fitra. Then his parents make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian, just as an animal is born intact. Later scholars, Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn al-Qayyim among them, arrived at a remarkably optimistic view of human nature from this principle. Every human being is born with a structural disposition towards truth. What obscures it is not permanent damage, but layers. Conditioning, culture, habit, nafsani accumulation, bad experiences. Layers can be removed. The fitra beneath them cannot be destroyed. This means that Tazkiya, the healing process that this entire channel is built on, is not the construction of a new self. It's actually uncovering the original self from beneath what obscured it. So you're not building from scratch, you are excavating something that was already there. And our tradition's refusal of despair is categorical. The Quran directly says, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Surely Allah forgives all sin. Qunut, despair of Allah's mercy, is the one state that our tradition explicitly forbids, because despair is the state that seals the door of healing shut. If you believe you're beyond repair, you will not seek repair. And the door that was always open stays closed because of your own belief. The entire project of Tazkiya rests on the premise that the Nafs can change, that all acquired disposition, the malakat, can be replaced, that the heart can be polished, that no state is permanent for the living human being. The trauma as permanent damage narrative says that some states are permanent. Our tradition instead says, not while you're alive, not while the door of tawbah is open, not while the fitra is intact, and the fitra is always intact. Telling someone they are permanently damaged is, in Islamic terms, not just scientifically questionable, it's a form of induced despair. And inducing despair is among the most harmful things that you can do to a human soul. The fourth criticism has to do with identity trap. Our modern trauma narrative has created an identity category, trauma survivor. This identity is presented as empowering, claiming your story, owning your wound, refusing to be silenced about what happened. But identity categories are very sticky. They become the lens through which you see everything. You stop being a person who experienced something difficult and start being a person whose core identity is the difficulty. Every new experience is filtered through, but I'm traumatized. Every relationship is seen through the wound. Every setback confirms the narrative. The trauma becomes your introduction, your explanation, your framework, and your prison. And the industry reinforces this. There are trauma memoirs, trauma podcasts, trauma awareness months, trauma-informed everything. The word becomes so ubiquitous that stepping outside this identity might feel like a betrayal of yourself, of your story, or of the community that validated you and is entirely built only around trauma. You see, you're not allowed to outgrow your trauma, because the culture has made the wound sacred. Let's notice the parallel with also a critique of self-help. I'm preparing a video on that topic too. The trauma industry tells you simultaneously you are strong and resilient and you are permanently damaged and need ongoing professional support. These contradictions exist because neither is meant to resolve. They keep you engaged, and most times they keep you purchasing. The Islamic model of the human being offers a fundamentally different identity structure. You are not your wound. You're not your history. You're not the worst thing that happened to you. You are your fitra, the original pattern that Allah created you on. And you're a salik, a traveler, someone on a path, someone in motion. The wound is part of the landscape you're moving through. It's not the destination, it's not the map, it's not your name. Tazkiya, the word itself tells you the model. It comes from the root zakawa, meaning purification and growth. This is not the construction of a post-traumatic identity, it's the removal of what obscures the good pre-existing self. We are never building new persons from the rubble. We are uncovering a person who was always there beneath it. I have studied how the classical sheikhs kept the muridin, their spiritual students, in preliminary stages for years, sweeping the zawiya, serving food, doing mundane, humble tasks. And this was never because the sheikh was punishing them. It's because these tasks are Nafs work in disguise. The identity being formed is not I am someone who suffered. It becomes I'm someone who serves, who works, who walks. The center of gravity shifts from what was done to you to what you're doing now. Our tradition acknowledges the wound and the pain like no other, but it refuses to let the wound become the decision center from which your nafs rules your life. Because a nafs that rules is always a very bad idea. The fifth criticism is about suffering without meaning. Now, every critic that we have discussed, like Sīnā, challenging the neuroscience, the metabolic psychiatrists challenging the causal model, the Nocebo researchers challenging the treatment assumptions, and the identity critics challenging the cultural politics, all converge on one point. The trauma narrative, as currently constructed, does not hold up. But notice what they offer in its place. Better study designs, exercise, CBT, metabolic health. These are useful, actually they're genuinely useful, but they share a feature. They're all techniques without a framework for meaning. They can tell you what to do differently. They cannot tell you why suffering exists, whether it serves any purpose, or what the human being is even supposed to do with pain beyond reducing it. The secular framework has no category for meaningful suffering. Suffering is damage, pain is a problem, and the goal is reduction. Why did this happen to me receives no answer because the framework has no answer. It can only manage. It cannot transform, and it cannot tell you what this pain is for. The Quran has a word for what the modern world calls trauma. The word is fitnah, and its etymology reveals a completely different understanding of what suffering does to the human being. The root fatana means the smelting of gold. It's the process of putting metal into fire to separate the pure from the impure. The gold was always there. It was mixed with lesser metals, with impurities. The fire does not create the gold. It just reveals it. It burns away everything that is not gold until what remains is pure. When the Quran says, do people think they will be left to say we believe and not be tested? The word is from this root. The test is not a malfunction. It's the process by which the heart reveals what it's actually made of. The states that we develop on the spiritual path, for example, ṣabr, tawakkul, rida, may feel genuine during periods of ease. But fitnah reveals whether they are really integrated into our character or merely temporary states, ahwal, that dissolve at the first pressure. You thought you had life was smooth and you felt patient. Then the crisis came and you collapsed. Now you know you didn't have sabr. You had the idea of sabr, and the fitnah showed you the truth. That's the opposite of damage. It's very informative. It's painful, humbling information, but the kind you cannot get any other way. Ibn al-Qayyim, in his Uddat al-Sabirin, explains that trials are divinely calibrated to the person's station and capacity. We know all, Allah does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear. They accelerate the journey by forcing the salik to actualize virtues that would otherwise remain theoretical. They burn away the attachments that the heart was holding without the person's awareness. Al-Ghazālī goes further. In book 32 of the Ihya, he distinguishes 3 types of fitnah. Fitnah that removes blessing, you lose something you had. Fitnah that introduces hardship, something difficult enters your life. And fitnah through abundance, you receive so much ease that your heart falls asleep. He considered the third the most dangerous because the person doesn't recognize it as a test. But the tradition is also very precise about limits. The practitioner must estimate what magnitude of trial the person can hold. If the trial is within their capacity, then accompaniment and interpretation are the intervention. If the trial is exceeding their capacity, stabilization comes first. Our tradition does not throw people into fire and say grow. It holds them while the fire does its work and pulls them back when the fire is too much. The Quranic framing is very consistent about this, that the person who passes through the fire emerges with a heart purer than the one that entered it, but not if they were left in it without support. The trauma industry offers you 2 positions. Either you are permanently damaged by what happened, or nothing happened and you should get over it. Neither is true, and neither is Islamic. The true Islamic position is a third thing entirely. What happened was real. It generated real pain. But you are more than the pain. You are a fiṭra, an original pattern, intact beneath every wound. You are a salik, a traveler on a path that includes fire by design. And the fire is not destroying you, it is revealing what you're made of. The virtues our world needs most, sabr, tawakkul, hilm, shukr, courage, compassion, are forged under pressure. They cannot be developed in comfort. Hilm, the capacity to hold difficulty with dignity, with an inner composure that doesn't collapse, grows every time you face something overwhelming and choose to stand. Every time you refuse to let your discomfort dictate your behavior, the hilm expands. The vessel strengthens, And what overwhelmed you last year may not overwhelm you this year. Not because it got easier, but because you got stronger. This is a noble vision of human life, a heroic one. And it is precisely what colonialism wanted to take from us. The colonial project and its modern descendants have always needed us to be weak, fragile, self-referential individuals, people too busy managing their wounds to stand up, to resist, to build, to lead. People whose discomfort is a medical condition rather than a challenge to be met with virtue. And the trauma industry, whatever its good intentions may be, serves this project. It produces human beings permanently oriented towards their own damage, who define themselves by what was done to them, who have been taught that the appropriate response to difficulty is to identify as its victim permanently. The Islamic tradition produces something else. Men and women who face what is overwhelming, who feel the full weight of it, and who choose to let it make them stronger rather than smaller. People who refuse to let discomfort dictate their behavior. People whose hilm was forged in fire and whose backs are straighter for having carried the weight. The Prophet ﷺ, he had the hardest life of any human being who ever lived. Orphaned before he could remember his parents, persecuted by his own people, exiled from his home, hunted, betrayed by allies, lost children in his arms, lost Khadija, the love of his life, his first believer, went hungry, was wounded in battle, buried companions, carried the weight of revelation on his shoulder. If suffering was simply damage, he would be the most damaged person in history. But nobody looks at his life and sees damage. They see the most complete, most courageous, most compassionate, most noble human being who ever walked the earth. The suffering was the fire that produced the purest gold the world has ever seen. Light. So you're not your trauma. You are your fitра, and your fitра is always intact. The Western critics we have talked about today say the science of permanent damage doesn't hold up. Our tradition says, well, of course it doesn't, because the human being was not made to be permanently damaged. The human being was made to be tested, to be refined, to walk through fire and emerge not untouched, okay, but purified. So our work is to walk through the wound, through the pain, accompanied by suhbah, supported by the tradition, held by the mercy of the one who calibrated the test to your exact capacity, and then to come out the other side as someone whose heart is purer, whose character is stronger, whose hilm is wider, and whose path is clearer than before.